Well, good morning, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about Maggie Tim's contribution to this week's discussion from Lorraine Code's book. And we're finishing off the book this week, last 2 chapters plus a short conclusion. So this is our chance to wrap up a little bit of what Code is trying to do. So I do ask you to join in on the discussion. It's been pretty quiet lately on that, and so you don't need to wait for me to put up my video before you jump in on it. So Code gives us these last couple of chapters. The chapter 6 really has to do with the question of imagination. And Chapter 7 has to do with this discussion about Nancy Olivieri, quite a fairly well-known case in Canada. I remember when it happened myself, when I was up there at the time. And so she's going to try and wrap up some of what she's been talking about previously in this book in these 2 chapters. And so let's take each of them in turn. I think Maggie did a good job of giving us a kind of overview of what's going on in these 2 chapters. She summarizes things pretty well. One thing that would be worth looking for is kind of a bit more of the conceptual importance, like what, so Code is talking about this notion of imagination. What does this do for her? So I think that's something worth raising. Let's talk a little bit about that, the notion of imagination. It's often thought of in terms of a feature of our mental world. Imagination is sometimes thought of as our ability to put perceptions together in new forms. So John Locke talked about it in those terms. And there are finer gradations that various thinkers use for it. But I think what Code wants to do with it is really work from the question of moral imagination. And that's why she goes for Mark Johnson and people like that to try and figure out exactly, what is the place of imagination, both in epistemology and in ethics. So let me give you a little bit of a context for that. Imagination is often not thought of as particularly part of ethics. Certainly in the modern period, when we have what we call an ethics of the right, or theories of the right, as opposed to theories of the good, our goal has been to try and figure out what the right thing to do is. I mean, how do you justify actions, basically? And so that has turned into a kind of calculus, and at least in some people's cases. For Kant, it was about duty. For Bentham and Mill, it was about a calculus that enabled us to get at anticipated outcomes. And so all of these are about kind of giving a justification for why you should do this rather than that. And you see this a lot in discussions of ethics. Even if you go into the New York Times magazine, every week there's a column called The Ethicist. Randy Cohen used to do it, and now it's being passed around to various people. And it's interesting reading those because it's always about, what should I do? What's the right thing to do? And so people will pose problems or difficult situations, and then the writer will say, well, here are the things you have to consider, and, a good ethical stand would be this, and they might sometimes distinguish it from legal obligations or something like that, and try and say exactly what ethics would require. So all fine and good, but what that's led to quite often is a notion of a kind of reductionist approach to ethics. In other words, we're trying to simplify it somehow. We're trying to say, there's a bottom line, there's a goal, here's what you ought to do, and if we can only get some clear justification for that, then everyone will sleep better at night and we'll know how to go forward and all of that sort of thing. Here's the problem with that, and it's probably a problem, shown most clearly analogously in the realm of politics. In politics, you have some politicians who will say, you're either with me or you're against me. You're either a good American or you're with the enemy or something like that. A very, very kind of cut and dried, very black and white, clear distinction. And we sometimes look at that as ethical clarity. And I think what Code and others would try and say is that what it really is a lack of imagination. In other words, if ethics is not simply about deciding what the right thing to do is in a particular situation, but it's about values, it's about thinking in terms of how do we maximize values for as many people as possible, how do we allow people to all get what they want, if at all possible, in other words, not make things a zero-sum game, then it's going to require of us what we might think of as moral imagination, this notion that we can come up with options that allow that to happen. It's not always a zero-sum game. It's not always black and white. And so, I think that's in certain parts, the starting point of what Code wants to do here. I mean, what she's doing in a certain sense is introducing the notion that if we take, and her framework is feminism, so if we take women's perspectives into account, it's not going to be only women, but it's a good example. If we take women's perspectives into account, we will have the possibility of a moral imagination that we didn't have before. Okay, so at the most basic level, there's that kind of addition to our moral universe. And if we accept the notion that morality has something to do with maximizing values, and there are questions we can raise about that. Are all values equal? Do we want them all? Is there never a situation where there's a black and white situation? Well, of course there might be, but most situations aren't like that. So if that's true, it seems like it's important to have some notion that more perspectives, more ways of understanding the world are better than fewer ways. And so she's really reacting against the kind of implicit notion within ethical discourse which supposes that an adult, white, straight, Western male is the kind of standard. And I understand what she's talking about in the sense that, as somebody who works in African philosophy, I've often seen that, the Western white male is the standard there as well. And so therefore, African perspectives are not necessarily treated as being particularly valuable. They're seen as in some way derivative or secondary or, something like that. So, I think, when Code is talking about, her hesitations about Mark Johnson, it has to be stressed that I think there's a lot that she likes about Johnson, but there's certainly some things that she finds problematic, and that, is the notion that the imagination is a limited imagination as far as she's concerned. He's writing a book on moral imagination, and in fact, he is unreasonably limited that imagination. So I think that's part of what's going on here, and she ends off the chapter, as she says herself, rather inconclusively, and I think part of the reason for that is that she is trying to throw this back onto the particular situation, and that's part of the reason that she talks so much about Amnesty International. Because they identify the problem of what happens when you throw things back onto the particular situation. Can you not talk about human rights then? Can you not generalize? Can you not, say that there are things that span cultures and span times and all of those sorts of things, and we ought to be able to critique, other nations or something like that? And of course she wants to do that. She is enough of an Enlightenment person in a certain sense to see the value of rights talk. At the same time, I think she is trying to find a way to bring perspectives to bear on this, bring women's and minority and whatever perspectives to bear on this, so that we're not simply justifying from a point of view of the privilege of white male experience. So, I think that's an important feature of what she's trying to do, and it kind of ties into her notion of the ecology, the epistemic ecology, or the ecology of knowledge. In a certain sense, we do have to take that place and the kind of lifeblood or the life world of that place, whatever place it is, into account. In other words, it's not simply a matter of abstracting out from the world and coming up with some Kantian kind of abstract notion of what duty is or what the good is or something like that, and then turning around and applying it back on the particular of the world. At the same time, it's not just about doing anthropology, looking at what specific people do in specific places and, leaving it at that. So she's grappling with an old problem in a certain sense, and trying to say this problem is it keeps rearing its head. Let's put it that way. Even in people that have the best of intentions, there's still a sense that we cannot help but be motivated by our frame on the world, and one of the effects of that is for us to forget that there are other frames on the world. It's no shame and no problem to have a place, to have a position, whether you're white or black or male or female or whatever. That's not the problem. The problem is coming to see those things as in some way exclusive, and it's very, very easy, I think she wants to say, to fall into that, to forget what a truly imaginative, moral world would look like. So, that's, I think, what she's doing in Chapter 6. And Chapter 7, I think, is a great kind of test case for all of this. It's a case in Canada of a whistleblower, Nancy Oliveri, Dr. Nancy Oliveri, who was having serious questions about a clinical trial that she was involved in, and felt that the true risks of the trial of the drug were not being disclosed to patients, and yet she was, the drug company was not keen on her disclosing those things. They thought it would undermine the marketability of the drug and all of those sorts of things. Well, she went forward anyway and let people know that, and therefore was fired for it, prosecuted for it, all of these sorts of things. Big case in Canada. And I think what the interesting take that Code has on this is that she is looking at the ways in which what she's calling epistemology, but really is kind of a creation of knowledge. So it's not necessarily epistemology in the sense of, in the sense of thinking about, the kind of foundations of knowledge, but rather it's epistemology in the kind of more limited sense of how do we come to knowledge? I mean, what are the conditions under which knowledge is available to us? And so she's looking at this case and saying, look, the depiction in the press, in the media, and in her critics and interlocutors, in all of these people, framed the whole situation in such a way that she could easily be dismissed. That if we think that imagination is important, this was very much being put to the side by the visual portrayals and the textual portrayals of her, of the insinuations about her, and so forth. And so, she does a kind of semiotics here. That's why she's got so many images, and the range of images really is quite interesting in this chapter. I mean, they do range from, images that I think show her as, a tough as nails warrior, to being, a nurturing person, to being vulnerable, to being not vulnerable, and all of these sorts of things. And these are all, in semiotics, we are bringing the history and the all of the other images that we've seen to bear on what we're looking at the moment. And so it's not like we can simply decode an image out of nothing. We decode images, or we understand images based on other images that we've seen. And so I think Code's argument is there's a long history of depicting women as lesser epistemological beings, as more moved by their passions, as manipulative, as sexualized, as a whole bunch of these things. And Code does the kind of common semiotic trick of, what if we substituted a male for Oliveri in some of these things? Could we ever have said the same thing or depicted a male in the same way as we are depicting her? And generally it's kind of ludicrous. No, we couldn't have. It doesn't. We would see immediately that there's some problem with that kind of depiction. And so Code's argument is, she's not arguing, as some people might think, that we need to have a kind of gender neutral sort of depiction or something like that. She's well aware of the facts of gender performance in the world and engenderment in the world, all of those sorts of things. What she is after, though, is identifying the ways in which what we think of as knowledge in a particular situation is framed, by really what amount to non-rational things, like images, like insinuations, like all of that kind of stuff. Her argument basically is that, there was an issue at stake here about this drug trial. There was a clear, real issue at stake, and that was really lost. That was getting clouded quite substantially by the fact that the press was starting to look at who she was as a person and thinking of her as the woman doctor. That always has that tag as if doctor is assumed to be male, but then when you put woman on it, it qualifies it. And so. This is, I think, Code's attempt to say, look, there is a kind of on-the-ground situation where social policy, ethics, and knowledge are kind of all conspiring here. I don't know if that's the right word, but working in tandem so that the ethical questions are being underplayed, the social questions are being underplayed, because there are epistemological questions, the question of trustworthiness, the question of whether you can believe her or not, the question of her scientific credibility, all of these sorts of things. All of those things are being questioned, both explicitly and implicitly, and that leads us to a position in thinking about the ethics of the whole situation where, the company can safely kind of push the issues to the side or not have to deal directly with them, And, so this is a very kind of interesting kind of test case for Code. And by no means is she the first to raise this kind of thing within science. I mean, you can see the target for her in this chapter. It really is the target of thinking about science as a kind of knowledge-producing enterprise, Here we have this thing which we are supposed to trust, which is the thing that is supposed to give us the most reliable kind of knowledge that we have available to us. And, the question that she raises, and many others have raised, she mentions Ursula Franklin, who's a prominent scientist in Canada who also has written about these things, and, any number of American writers and European writers, under what conditions does scientific knowledge get generated? Who gets to say, where are the priorities? I mean, all of these sorts of things bring what feel like non-rational elements into the rational process of science. And, Code is not one who is going to want to say, well, then science, it's not trustworthy, we got to get rid of it, it's we can ignore it. I mean, she's not by any means saying that, right? What she's saying is that she wants science to be made richer, not to be gotten rid of. She wants everyone to have a voice at the table. A famous example that was written about by some other people in the past was by Evelyn Fox Keller, who's a philosopher of science. And Fox Keller wrote about the early days of DNA formulation, the formulation about the theories about DNA. And she points out that early on there were a couple of models, one which she calls the master molecule model, and the other she calls the solid state or the steady state molecule model of the molecule. And in both of these cases, they were trying to figure out, so what is a DNA molecule actually like? And the argument at the time was that, between these two models, the master molecule model was the model in which specific genes have specific outcomes. And so there's a kind of master kind of switch, a master kind of control panel, as it were, that issue in certain kind of outcomes for an organism. The steady state model, on the other hand, was one that was predicated much more on a kind of, if you wish, community of genes working together for particular effects, even admitted a kind of two-way relationship such that the environment could affect the genetic structure and the genetic structure affects the organism. And early on, Fox Keller argues that the master molecule model won out, not because of its merits as a scientific theory, but because those who espoused it were primarily male, and their orientation towards the world was a patriarchal orientation, a hierarchical orientation. as more women started getting involved, she argues, they started investigating other aspects of this other model, the steady state model, and started to find that actually the genetic code is way more complex than that kind of simplified, this gene does that kind of thing. Sometimes that happens. The gene for eye color, for example, is pretty straightforward, but the vast majority of genes don't really work like that. And so, her argument is that there would have been a better model available right from the beginning if the kind of political and gender culture of science had been willing to hear it, had been willing to allow it. And so that's a kind of example of a construction of knowledge, which I think Code is trying to get at. She's trying to say, look, we need an environment, an ecology that is a rich ecology. It's not it's not a stripped down thing where there's kind of a path to knowledge which is very kind of technological, do this, and out comes knowledge at the other end. It's a messy affair. It's an affair where you need deliberation, you need encounter, you need all of these things, and we tend not to lay the foundations for that. And so I think the takeaway kind of point that I see in this book is that she is trying to say, look, how do we make the world into a place of true deliberation, so that our knowledge is a place where true deliberation can happen, and our ethics is a place where true deliberation can happen between people, instead of supposing that, the goal is to produce, knowledge as quickly as possible, which can give us widgets as quickly as possible. So anyway, that's, I think, what's going on with Code's last couple of chapters, and I think, Maggie picks up some of that very nicely. And so, what do you think? I mean, is this a plausible approach? I know that she's, for, hardcore philosophers, she's using notions of epistemology perhaps more loosely than, it might be used especially in analytic circles. But I think she is getting at something important here. That is, the generation of knowledge does have a certain kind of philosophical foundation to it, and we have to, in a certain sense, figure out exactly what to do about that. All right, so I think that's enough for this chapter. We move on to Philip Kitcher after this, and I do hope that you read that and that you jump in with the discussions, and so we can figure out what he's up to. The point of this course, in a certain sense, has been to raise questions about how the relationship between knowledge and ethics in the world. And I think the Oliveri case is a great example of this. Some of the cases I've been putting up on the discussion board are good examples of this. I'd like you to look around you and see, can you find some examples where the questions of ethics are really ultimately questions of knowledge, and not just questions about adding to our knowledge, like there are things we don't know that we wish we knew, but questions about how knowledge actually works, disputes about the nature of knowledge itself. I think we can certainly find that between political views of the world, sometimes between religious views of the world, sometimes between a kind of patriarchal or hierarchical view of the world versus other views of the world. But I'm interested in the question of, we're moving ourselves towards the question of what difference does this stuff make? I mean, once we figure this out, does it give us a handle on how to act more ethically in the world, how to argue for ethical positions better, how to affect change in the world? Does it alternatively raise questions about the ethics that are embedded within epistemology itself? Does ethics come after epistemology, after our notions of knowledge, or is it actually embedded right in the middle of it? And so I think there's still some very interesting questions we have to face, and I think Kitcher is going to take us straight to issues of science and democracy, so I'm looking forward to seeing what we have there. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed Code's book, and we'll talk about Kitcher next week. All right, thanks.